For 13 years of portrait photography, my shutter was basically on autopilot. I'd set it to around 1/200th of a second for most of the shots that I needed, and then if I was intentionally trying to capture motion, I would just bump it up a little bit from there. And since it worked where I needed it to, I kind of stopped thinking about it. But what I didn't think much about is that shutter speed controls more than just blurring and freezing motion. It controls time. And time opens up a whole creative range that freezing and blurring motion don't even begin to cover. That image on my thumbnail is a 30-second exposure, and your camera is capable of doing that. And shutter speed is what makes that possible. So here's what we're covering: what shutter speed actually controls, how to read the numbers, and both sides of this setting, including the side that most photographers never intentionally touch. But before we get to the exciting part, I want you to know exactly what this setting is doing every time you press your shutter, because once you see it, everything else about shutter speed will make a lot more sense. Most photographers think of shutter speed as a freeze and blur control, where we bump the shutter speed up faster to freeze motion, or we slow it down intentionally to blur that motion creatively. And that's true, shutter speed does do that, but that's only part of the picture. And that's the reason a lot of photographers feel like they're fighting this setting instead of using it to its full capacity. Shutter speed actually controls two different things, and most people only think about one of them. The first thing it controls is time. Your shutter is literally a door that opens and closes every time you take a photo, and the number on your camera tells you how long that door stays open, all the way from 1/8000th of a second to a full 30 seconds. And the sequence works the same way that your aperture stops do. They go from 1/8000th to 1/4000th to 1/2000th, 1000th, and so forth. And each of those stops doubles or halves the time that the shutter stays open. And beyond 30 seconds, there's a feature called bulb mode, and that's where the shutter stays open as long as you're pressing the shutter button down or until you use a remote release to close it. And we're going to come back to bulb mode a little bit later, because that's the side of this setting that gets really interesting. The second thing that shutter speed controls is exposure. The longer that shutter door stays open, the more light comes in, and the faster it closes, the less light comes in. And here's when this becomes useful: when motion has nothing to do with it. If you're shooting outdoors on a really bright day and you want a really low aperture to blur that background really beautifully, but your image is blown out and too bright, bump up the shutter speed. More speed means that less light is coming in and your exposure comes down. That's one of the most useful things this setting can do, and a lot of photographers never even think of it that way. And once you see shutter speed as something that controls time and light, the full range of this setting starts to click, and you can use it intentionally instead of just reacting to it. If blurry images have been a frustration for you and not always knowing why your images don't come out right, I have a free troubleshooting guide called Fix It Fast that covers the 5 most common photo problems that photographers run into. The link is in the description. Now let's look at the fast side of the setting and why the numbers might be bigger than you expect. My default portrait work was always around 1/200th of a second, which is fast enough for a still subject, but not so fast that I'm fighting with my exposure. And for anything with real motion, like kids or pets or anything unpredictable, I just bump it up from there. And for jump shots or anything with faster movement, I'm usually at a minimum of 1/500th of a second. And then I compensate with my ISO if I still need to balance that exposure out. I'd always heard about that 1 over focal length rule, which is to match your shutter speed with the focal length you're shooting at to prevent camera shake. For example, if you're shooting with a 200mm lens, you would use a shutter speed of at least 1/200. And even though I've been familiar with this rule, I've never felt that it was fast enough in practice. I'd still get occasional blur from my subjects moving or a little camera shake if I wasn't perfectly steady, so I'd usually bump it up a little bit higher depending on the situation and which lens I was using. Several years ago, my son and I were out at the park, and he was riding on his bike and wanted me to try to take a shot of him standing on his bike while he was riding it. And so I was trying to freeze him mid-movement and make it all look great. And at the time, I thought I had a fast enough shutter speed, but I actually didn't. I was using 1/200th of a second, and there was still a lot of blur in the image, and the wheels, and him, and I didn't quite nail the shot. But here's the thing: if 1/200th of a second isn't fast enough to freeze motion for a kid on a regular bike riding regular speeds, that seems wild to me, because 1/200th of a second is extremely fast in my mind, but things actually move a lot faster than we think they do. And of course, the faster your shutter speed, the better you freeze motion of your subject. And for still portraits, 1/200th of a second is usually plenty, but for kids moving around and anything unpredictable, bump it up more and use your ISO to compensate for your exposure if it's needed. And for any real sort of action, start at 1/500th of a second and bump it up from there once you take test shots and check them and see if they're actually freezing what you want them to freeze. The fast side of shutter speed is where a lot of portrait photographers photographers live, who are shooting still subjects in still situations. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's still only half of what this setting can do. There's a whole other side of this setting that most portrait photographers never intentionally use when they're shooting still subjects all the time. And that's where it gets really interesting. If this is already starting to click for you, do me a favor and hit like. It helps YouTube to show it to more photographers who want to know what shutter speed truly is capable of. If you shoot portraits where people are in still poses in still settings, intentionally slow shutter speed may rarely come up. Maybe the occasional creative blur shot, like someone dancing at a wedding reception, or a dress twirl where you want to make it look like the fabric is moving, maybe it gets used like that sometimes. But many of us learned really early that slow shutter means blurry image and blurry image means bad image. And that lesson got baked in. And honestly, it was true for me too. Even though I knew that intentionally slow shutter speed was possible, curiosity was never quite enough to push me to actually figure it out. There was always some other priority, and honestly, there was always the tripod situation. Using a slow shutter speed almost always means using a tripod, and I don't love using mine, as great as it's supposed to be. Between the quick release mount that's supposed to screw into the bottom of your camera base, and then extending and leveling all the legs, and then losing the ability to just move and turn and reframe any way that I want to, like with handheld, especially in portrait work where I'm constantly repositioning. That's just how I'm used to working. So for portrait sessions, I'd rather just brace myself against a wall or a tree if I need extra stability. I tried to capture the northern lights from right here in Tennessee a few years back because everybody was capturing them on their cell phone and it looked amazing. So I thought surely I can get even better images with my actual camera. So I pulled out my tripod and my Canon 5D and did what I thought was the right thing, which was setting it all up and choosing the right manual mode settings to be able to capture this. And in the end, the ones that people took with their cell phones completely beat the photos that I took with my camera. Here's why. And this is actually really important to know, that newer phones have something called computational astrophotography built into them. Say that 10 times fast. And all that means is they automatically take multiple exposures, they stack and blend them, and then they reduce the noise using an algorithm and some special software. And most DSLRs can get better results than cell phone cameras, but it requires knowing exactly how to set it up, using bulb mode and a remote release and long exposure noise reduction turned on in your camera menu. So in situations like these, it's not a camera equipment problem, it's really just a setup problem. And that's exactly what we're covering right now. I'll admit that my slow shutter creative attempts are pretty limited, but here's what I've actually tried in the past and what happened as a result of these trials. At wedding receptions, I would lower my shutter speed and let the light streak and blur in the background while people were dancing. And sometimes it came out interesting and sometimes not. And my second shooter was always better at getting usable results with this because she knew a thing or two about using her on-camera flash to keep her subject sharp while the background motion blurred around them. But I could never quite nail it the same way. If my flash settings weren't right, my ISO would push me into grainy territory before I got the results that I wanted. The one time slow shutter did work for me was when I had a senior girl at the local fair. She was standing completely still while the crowd was moving all around her. The shutter was intentionally slow, and since she was standing still the whole time, she was in sharp focus and the crowds that were walking past her were blurred creatively. It's one of the more interesting blurred movement shots I have, and I essentially stumbled into it on a whim. There's a whole range of what intentional slow shutter can do when you use it on purpose. Silky water or motion trails, environmental motion like leaves or fabric in the wind, and at the farther end, there's light painting and writing with sparklers and pretty much anything you can think of. Your creativity is the only limit here. For anything longer than 30 seconds, you're using bulb mode, and you need to use a remote release, not just holding down the button on your camera, because your hand on the button the whole time can shake the camera, even if you're using a tripod. On Canon cameras, bulb mode is the B on your mode dial. On Nikon and most Sonys, set your camera to manual mode and keep turning your shutter speed control until you pass 30 seconds and it reads bulb. For portrait photographers especially, shutter speed is the clunky third wheel in the exposure triangle, the setting that you just manage so it doesn't ruin your shot. But the slow side of this setting can genuinely open up creative possibilities inside of a portrait session that has nothing to do with avoiding soft focus blur, such as environmental motion, intentional blur around a still face, and light painting as a feature in an outdoor session. These creative options don't have to stay in the back burner anymore. If you want to start experimenting with this without jumping straight into manual mode, try using shutter priority. That's TV on the mode dial for Canon or S on Nikon and Sony. You set the shutter speed and the camera handles aperture and ISO. And it's a great way to play with slow shutter better during the day, like blurring a passing car or water or a crowd moving through a space. But when you're ready to go darker and use longer exposures at night, that's when manual mode gives you the control that you actually need, because shutter priority will start pushing your ISO up to compensate for the exposure, and you'll end up with more grain in your images. If any of this is bringing up questions about why your photos aren't coming out the way you want, like blurry when they should be sharp, or something just looks off and you can't quite name what it is, Fix It Fast is a free troubleshooting guide that I put together that walks through the 5 most common photo problems that photographers run into, including unintentionally blurry images. And it's a diagnostic tool, not just a tip list. The link is in the description. Go grab it. Shutter speed isn't just the setting that keeps your photos sharp. It's the setting that controls time. And that means it can freeze a moment or stretch it out or turn it into something that you couldn't have planned. Knowing what shutter speed can do and knowing what to dial it in for real everyday shooting situations are 2 different things. And getting sharp images is a priority for most photographers, but there's a lot more to sharp photos than just choosing the correct shutter speed. And I have a video on exactly that. If you want to go deeper on exactly what those factors are, watch this one next.